So I thought we could talk tonight about this phrase, always being, always becoming. So the phrase, I first heard it in a discourse by Adyashanti. The Buddhist said that being is always becoming. Being is always becoming, which is a little different, right? It implies that you know, being is in a constant state of manifestation. So it seems to have a direction to it that the phrase always being, always becoming doesn't have. There's more of an equivalency there, you could say. So it's a little different. There's also a 14th century German theologian and mystic, really, Meister Eckhart, about this beautiful phrase that God is always begetting the only begotten. So he's not talking about a singular person. This is always begetting the only begotten. Only begotten is this, all of it, the entire unity of creation, just in a ever refreshing, cataclysmically creative movement of creation, always begetting. So we have a sort of a rich history of these terms being and becoming. But this phrase always being and always becoming seems contradictory. It seems like, well, if something always is, what is it that it is becoming? You know, we only talk about something becoming if it isn't that already, and it's on its way towards something in that direction, but not yet arrived, right? So putting these two concepts together, always being, always becoming, almost seems like one of those Zen sayings that don't make any sense to our logical minds, that how can something always be and always and is always becoming? How could both of those be true at the same time? So when we start to really inquire into this, the always becoming part is perhaps more familiar. We're just growing up in this culture, we're very familiar with the idea of self-improvement, always working towards some future goal. We may not be there yet, but we're on our way. We're working in that direction. The carrot is still well out in front of us, and we have some kind of plan about where we think we're going. So we're sort of familiar with this idea of becoming, at least in the worldly sense, but this is. It seems like this becoming also has a sense of worthiness tied to it. We have a self-judgment about ourselves and how well we're doing. So there's not only the doing, but then there's this sort of evaluation process that happens, whether we do it to ourselves or we think that there's some other entity somewhere that's will judge us now or in the future. So so the sense of improving or doing seems to be intimately tied with this idea of being judged or being where we're always self-evaluating whether we're worthy or not. And many of us are caught in a sense of unworthiness, or others might be caught in a sense of, yes, surely I'm worthy. Either one is just two sides of the same coin. but they're both involved self-evaluation, right? Um, so this, it seems like the one thing that we never question is whether worthiness has anything to do with what we're talking about. We think it does. I mean, it does in maybe other areas of our life, but in spirituality, we never really question whether it really has anything to do with worthiness or not. Do we know? Do we know for sure? Or is it just one of those assumptions that we carry over from worldly life that somehow spiritual realization has something to do with earning it, deserving it? It's sort of natural to believe that, but do we know that it's actually true? So we're quite familiar with this idea of working towards something, becoming. This spiritual journey happens without some effort. Sometimes it does, and there's no rules here. So sometimes people awaken with no effort at all. They didn't even know, they had no interest in spirituality, and they were getting on a bus or walking across the parking lot, and suddenly they had a massive awakening. It happens, right? It's probably not something that you want to bet your life on. The other thing that's we've some of us find ourselves in is just a state of I don't know, high anxiety or chaotic lifestyle, or um, immersed in anger or rage or fear or um, drama, any of these powerful emotions, um, you know, are not always an obstacle, but often they just sap our energy to the degree that we have nothing left to really investigate this process. However, again, there's no rules. So for some people, like Byron Katie, who woke up out of the depths of alcoholism, and Eckhart Tolle, who woke up out of suicidal depression, sometimes you sort of have to hit bottom before you're willing to see things in a different way. So that's not necessary, and it's not recommended. But if you find yourself on that kind of path, that's your path. You need to find your way through that. But for most of us, it's a question of having the desire, having the curiosity to really get at the depth of what this life is about. And that has to do with sort of a sustained willingness and a certain degree of courage, certainly a degree of self-honesty, to be willing to look deeply at our own life. So it's in some sense it's contradictory to the statement of always being, and yet here we're saying some effort may very well be required in probably almost all cases. There's some kind of sustained effort, and so it sounds contradictory, but that's where the always being comes in. That recognition of what we truly are, the discovery of that, which is this awareness that we pointed to earlier, as a spacious, alive, aware presence. So that beingness is something that has always been there. Our discovery of it might happen at a particular point in time. But when that is discovered, what we recognize is that it's always been there. Right? It's almost like how could I have missed it? It's so obvious once it's seen. Um, but we can, perhaps point to it. Just if we think back to our childhood, as far back as we can remember, there's always been this sense of um, I, being the one that was having whatever experience I was having. The experience itself changed throughout life as we grew up. The circumstances changed, the bodies changed, everything changed, but there was always this sense of I, a sense of being present for at the deepest level. So it's not the identity of I, but the sense of being this present as the observer, the one who is aware. Right? We may not have thought of it in those terms, but that's the sense of it. It was always me going out to play, me going on my first date, me going to school, me, etc. So that sense has been continuous through our life, and I'd suggest it's so much, not even a part of ourselves. It's so essentially what we are that even when we dream at night, when we forget about most other facts about our life, we have people in our dream that we don't know. We're in places that we've never seen before. All the circumstances have changed. The one thing that hasn't changed is the sense in the dream that the circumstances in the dream are being perceived by me, right? There's always that sense of I still there. So that's the continuity of that, the consistency of that suggests that there's something of importance there. So when we take that and discover what that beingness actually is, there's the potential in this lifetime to discover it, not as a concept or an idea or belief, but as the living reality of being aware, being awareness itself, as the fundamental identity of what we truly are. And when we discover that, we see that it's not something that we've attained. It's not a state that wasn't there at one point in our life and now is. We just discovered that that's what we've always been. We didn't, there's nothing that we could have done to earn it. Right? We can't earn it because it's what we are. We can't attain what we've always been. It's not something that we deserve, and other people don't. It's not something that's doled out by some divine being to some people, not to others. It's not doled out because it is the essence of life itself. It's not even an attribute of life. It is how life is lived through this awareness, through this consciousness. That's how the entirety of our experience is witnessed, experienced, is within this field of awareness. So what we come to discover is that which we were looking for has been there all along. This is quite a surprise because we keep looking elsewhere, and eventually we discover what has been present all along. It's actually what's been looking, that movement to seek, to find, to desire, to want, to hope for, to long for. All of that movement is source itself seeking itself. So when we come upon this recognition of what we already are, it's an astonishing thing to discover that what we are is not separate in any way from the entirety of creation. Discover that, although we may have grown up sensing that we were separate from everything else, from the world, from other people, that we discover that we could never be. We discover that we're an inseparable part of the one creation. So it's astonishing enough that there's one creation. But we imagine that there's sort of creation and then there's me separate from it, which when we really stop to think about it is actually a position of arrogance, to believe that somehow as a separate physical being that we're somehow of our own creation, somehow separate from everything else. Not possible. So this is the discovery of our innate beingness, something that we've always been. When that recognition is present, what's actually absent is that sense of separate self. The sense of separate self is how we hold ourselves back from that one creation, how we hold ourselves back from life. And when that belief in our self-isolation gets whittled away, what's left is the recognition of what we've always been. So it's not an attainment, it's really letting go of all these ideas that we hold about ourselves that aren't true. And many of those ideas we're quite certain about. So when those ideas are shattered, when those beliefs are shattered by life, usually, it can sometimes be painful. It doesn't have to be, but it sort of depends on how tightly we're holding on to our beliefs. So it's not, these beliefs aren't something that we can sort of forcibly drop, like I just won't believe that. If we're having to forcibly drop our belief, it means that we're still holding on to it. A belief that we just see isn't true, we don't have to try to drop it. It'll just drop by itself. There's several things that we can notice about just this sense of beingness when we touch into this. We can notice that it is already quiet. Right? Like we pointed out before, the mind may or may not be quiet, but what is noticing the busy mind is already quiet. You can also notice that this awareness is already at peace, regardless of whatever circumstances may be happening. You can also notice that this awareness isn't judgmental. Our mind is often judgmental about whatever it is that we're doing, but this awareness is not. It's present. It doesn't flinch or turn away or reject some experience that we may be having. It's there for everything. It's actually the only way that we know anything is happening. So everything can only happen within that awareness. We might turn away from ourselves, but That awareness will be there for everything. The other sense of it is that it's already complete. It's not like we become more and more aware. It's not like some people are more aware than other people. The awareness is awareness. There's no gradations. There's no levels of awareness. Awareness is just awareness. It's complete in itself. It's miraculous enough in itself. What changes is the degree to which our mind is interjecting ideas and opinions and beliefs and sort of fogging up the window for that awareness to be lived transparently. So what changes is the degree of our misunderstanding. That's what evolves. So oftentimes in spirituality, you hear people talk about becoming more aware. It's not the awareness that needs to become more aware. It's our all this things that we impose on awareness through things that we believe, all our thoughts, all our concepts, all our opinions, all our judgments, all our unforgivenesses, all our regrets, all our shames, all of that. That's what clouds the purity of that beingness. Okay, so that being is already as it is, it's already complete, it's a done deal. We may or may not know that. Doesn't do any good to take that on as a belief. At best, it may be useful to take that on as a possibility to be discovered for oneself. It doesn't matter what anybody else says about it. It only has value if it is your own discovery. Once that's discovered for yourself, no one can take it away. No one can convince you that it's not real, well, other than your mind. But the actual direct experience of it is self-confirming. There's no doubt. The mind may come in and raise doubts and questions and wonder whether it was real or true, but we can see that as just an attempt by the mind to pull us back into its conceptual field, which is actually a good thing. It keeps us honest. It also tests our knowingness. If we can be pulled out of awareness by the mind, whatever trick the mind uses to do that is worthy of some investigation. Like, is it really true? Whatever the mind comes up with. So the mind knows us very well. It knows how to pull us back into its sphere of influence under its managerial wing. Okay, so let's talk about becoming. So becoming, in the idea that we talked about before, self-improvement, is different in what we're talking about now, this always becoming. And whereas this beingness is already complete, fulfilled from the get-go, the becoming part is not. The becoming part is a process. It's gradual, and there's no end to it. There's no end point called perfection. There's always more to be seen. And the reason that there's always more to be seen is that the beingness itself is infinite. Therefore, these finite forms, these body minds, as they become more and more aligned with our deeper understanding, gradually become clearer, but there's always more to see because we're working with a finite form, a thoroughly conditioned finite form. So it might be that there's a glimpse, a flash of seeing where we think we've seen the entirety of it. Everything is so clear, and we want to run out and tell all our friends. And then we find that there is more to be seen. There's more. It's not that the recognition of our true nature wasn't real, but the implications of that are endless. So it's almost like the recognition can be quite sudden, but it might take some time for the body mind to catch up. It's almost like the memo went out, but the rest of the body didn't quite get it. So it might take some time. It's, I mean, this is sort of a silly example, but let's say the CEO of Exxon Oil Company suddenly decided that he wanted the company to totally change the business model and go all in on solar energy. And, makes the announcement, and the employees and staff and management and everything are surprised, and it would take some time for the corporate culture to shift their thinking from being a company that extracts things from the earth to something that is in the business of sustainability. And so it just takes some time. It's sort of like the body is like that. It's the recognition might be there, but the implications of how that is lived through the body will take some time. In Zen, they recommend giving it, 10 to 15 years. And I'd say that's about right. I'd say that's about right. And there are risks to actually trying even to talk about it very much before then. So this is this process of the body sort of catching up can be confusing because one part of us recognizes our infinite nature, and yet we might find ourselves acting in a way that is quite conditioned, that we know isn't really how we would like to be seen acting, or saying things that come out of past patterns. And so it can be quite confusing. How can I know this and then act like this? And it's almost like how can both things be happening at the same time? And sometimes we can think that we didn't actually realize what we did because we're still getting caught up in old emotional patterns, for example. But it can be confusing like that for a while, because it's really like learning to function in a whole new paradigm. You would think you could wake up to your true nature and then just act from that recognition from that point on, but it's not like that at all. So there's this almost like a sense of duality. There's this recognition of our awareness, this spaciousness, this unconditioned beingness. And then on the other hand, we can look down and see our body, our form, our conditioning, our habits, our quirks, our patterns, and our limitations, the whole finite quality of our body minds. And it looks like we're talking about two different things, But from the point of view of awareness, awareness doesn't have a problem with that. Our mind has a problem with that. But when we settle into an understanding that gradual, sometimes it's called embodiment, this gradual process of the body mind sort of catching up with our realization. That body, when we catch on that embodiment just takes time. There's always more to see. Always, it's really the implications of what we've seen, how that plays out in this life and through this body mind, and that just takes some time. So the word embodiment, we need to be careful the way we use that word, because it sounds like something is coming from the outside into the body, and that's not the case. It sounds almost like we're talking about some divine spirit entering the body. It's not that. There's actually nothing outside. Everything is only one thing, so everything is within. So it's not an outside anything. It's just our conditioned humanness. Really, it's the embodiment is the conditioned body mind gradually coming into alignment with what we more deeply know. And there's a sense while that's happening that there's almost like a gap, a gap between what we know and then how we are in the world, and how we behave, how we act. And there's a gap between the two. And this process of embodiment is really closing the gap. It's almost like having an elephant in the room, and the elephant is the gap, and we can sort of dance around it or ignore it, or but eventually we have to deal with that gap, seeing through any patterning that is inconsistent with what we more deeply know. So let's just say, if we knew for certain in our own direct experience that everyone is in essence one manifestation appearing in many different ways. If we knew for certain that as we are, we're okay. We're part of that one manifestation. And that we are inseparable from life as a whole, without judgment, just as is. If we knew that with certainty for ourselves, what would we do? How would we act? What would we say? How would we treat other people? How would we treat ourselves? Why would we get out of bed in the morning? Who would we hang out with? Would there be fear in our life? How would we view death? Would we want the world to be different? Would we want other people to be different? Would we expect other people to be other than they are? Would we fear death? So these kinds of questions, the answers to these would be different before we recognized our true nature. They'd be different after we recognized our true nature. And those questions are really have to do with how we show up, how we live our life, and that how we learn how to move in accordance with our recognition of our innate awareness is this process of embodiment, is this process of becoming. So it sounds like this becoming process is like the old self-improvement process, but it's different. There's a number of distinct differences. Whereas the old self-improvement process, a lot of it came from a sense of lack, a sense of, I want things to be better. Better for who? Better for me. So the movement after awakening is much more out of a sense of, it's not out of a sense of lack at all, because what we truly are has been realized. So it's much more out of a sense of doing things from a sense of joy or abundance, or gratitude or appreciation or love, those kind of movements. Whereas before we may have been operating or in relationships or even in jobs where there was a sense of doing it out of a sense of obligation. I ought to be doing this. I ought to have these responsibilities. And that sense of obligation is not there in the same way. It's out of a sense of out of the sense of the recognition that we all are essentially one being, and how do we move with that? So it's a different sense than feeling obligated. There's also not a movement that comes out of a sense of fear of change, fear of whereas once we may have been in relationships out of need or fear of leaving it. Now we might find ourselves free to see what's actually true. Relationships that are true will survive. Ones that are based on fear and insecurity, probably not. Those are at risk. Whereas at one point there may have been a resistance to sitting quietly, doing nothing, being alone with our own mind. And maybe that showed up as excessive busyness. Now there might still be activity, maybe not, but it wouldn't be out of a sense of avoidance, of avoiding being alone with our own self. We're comfortable with that. Whereas before there might be a sense of doing things for a future goal. Now it feels much more like the joy of it is the doing rather than the goal. The goal is sure pleasurable when it happens, but there is as much joy in the doing as it happens. There's actually a wonderful saying by attributed to the Buddha that said the Dharma is good in the beginning, the Dharma is good in the middle, and the Dharma is good in the end. So the teaching, that evolution, that becoming, that entire process is good. It's all good. So we might also, in prior to recognition of what we actually are, we may have engaged in service to others. But if we really look closely, many times we find that we're doing that to feel better about ourselves, right? Or doing it because we feel like we ought to, or we've been taught that it's the right thing to do, or we're doing it to gain merit. But being of service, once our true nature is recognized, has a different quality to it. It may look similar, but it's not doing it for self-gratification, basically. Uh, it doesn't even feel like service because you're not doing it with that intent in mind. There's a need, you feel to act, you act, and without concern about outcome, you do what you feel to do as best you can do it, and just because that is the next obvious thing to do. And so it has a different quality. It may look similar, but it has quite a different quality to it. The other thing that's different is that we don't torture ourselves with decisions. Whereas in the past we might have engaged in the mental duels of pros and cons, and trying our best to make the right decision. With the recognition of what we truly are, then that movement doesn't really feel like decisions anymore. It just feels like life is sort of nudging us this way or that way, or suggesting this path or that, and we learn to trust those gentle nudges to move in that way without agonizing over the thought. So so the mind gradually settles down, not because we're trying to settle it down, just because that's what happens when we cease assigning it ultimate authority. We also see that any ultimate knowingness doesn't reside there, doesn't reside in that conceptual realm. So we don't look to the mind for those kind of answers. And when we've sort of pulled the plug on energizing the mind, it settles down by itself without us having to try to quiet it. It will quiet down on itself, and it sort of falls into its proper place in the scheme of things. When we need it, it's a wonderful tool. When it's there, we need it, it'll function well. The rest of the time, which is most of the time, it'll just be there as in its potentiality. But its proper role is subservient to what we know to be true. So this phrase, always becoming, always being, always becoming, eventually there's a convergence, right? It's never finished, but there's a movement towards where what we do and say and imagine is more and more in alignment with what we know ourselves to be. So this phrase, always being, always becoming, we can say, well, which is it? Which am I? Am I beingness, or am I just this body mind always becoming? But this is just the mind talking. The answer, of course, is yes. That whole convergence, always being, always becoming.